Shabbat Shalom. As someone who taught English to foreigners, I've discovered that the only thing harder than idioms are aphorisms. The idioms, of course, are, odd quirks of a language that don't really mean what they say. Aphorisms, proverbs, are supposed to mean what they say, but oftentimes, whenever they were written, whichever grammatical style was in vogue at the time, and certainly whatever was done to make them rhyme, doesn't really help a person who's unfamiliar with their meaning understand what in the world is going on in this phrase. Some of them you probably know, and would be perfectly fine. If I were to say, you can't have your cake and eat it too, you all pretty much understand what that means. Even if you're not a native English speaker, you're probably okay with that one. If I say, on the other hand, the proof's in the pudding, what in the world does that mean? Right? The proof is in the pudding. Buried inside of the pudding, there's proof. Right? Well, that's especially difficult because it's already been mangled. It's supposed to be, the original phrase was, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Meaning if you want to know if the pudding's good or not, you have to taste it. But it's gotten squashed, as language does. I even had a friend in college who was absolutely staggered when he learned that the way he had been understanding a phrase was 180 degrees in the wrong direction. A friend in need is a friend indeed. Does that mean that it's being said sarcastically? A friend in need, that's a friend indeed. That was how he understood it to be. And he always thought that was a very strange aphorism because it made it sound like you weren't supposed to help people. And I explained to him that no, it's saying that if you are a friend to a friend who is in need, then you are indeed a friend. It would have been much easier with more words. But unfortunately, that's not how aphorisms work. And you should not be surprised that in Hebrew and in Judaic studies, we end up with similar problems. We end up with phrases that become somewhat well-known, depending upon the circles you move in. But as well as the phrases are known, the meaning behind them is completely lost. And I'd like to give you my favorite, absolutely on the surface of it, completely bewildering or perhaps possibly offensive phrase. Everybody ready to be offended before you understand? Good. Converts are to Israel as difficult as the scabs of Tzara'at. Tzara'at is the condition that usually gets translated as leprosy in the Torah, but of course it's not actual leprosy as we know it as a medical condition. Let me repeat that phrase for you one more time. Converts are to Israel as difficult as scabs of Tzara'at. Now you should understand, scabs and such and things like that didn't quite have the same negative connotation, but Tzara'at, this was not exactly a happy condition. Right? Tzara'at was something that could make a person ritually impure, if indeed it was, as identified by the Kohanim, by the priests, and have a long purification process. So it doesn't exactly sound like a friendly phrase. After all, we know, and this is taken from the section of the Talmud in Yevamot, which discusses welcoming and inviting people in who wish to convert. It really doesn't seem to fit the pattern of all the other phrases that are going on in that section. So what in the world did Rabbi Chelbo mean when he said this? Well, you're probably going to be stunned. There are different interpretations. So let's start off with the classic. The classic is Rashi, and Rashi has as his penchant a knack for finding the most basic structural understanding that fits within the context from which something was originally said. He's not trying to go off in flights of fantasy. He wants to nail it down precisely, at least in his estimation. And in his estimation, he says this is indeed a very negative phrase, that Rabbi Chelbo is referring to the experience with converts that we know from the past, which can occasionally cause trouble. Think, for example, in the ancient world, which Rabbi Chelbo lived in, and certainly everyone before him, if you were going to become Jewish, what were you leaving behind? What's that? Your foreskin, spoken like a man. The ladies are like, what? What's the big deal? Okay, you're leaving that behind. which is no small problem. Your diet, your family, your meals, you're not thinking at all about what life was like among the idolatrous pagan communities and what Israel saw as being their life. Right? Imagine you're living during the waning days of the Second Temple period with Roman occupation. What do the Romans do for fun? They wrestle naked. They have orgies. They have lions tearing people apart. They have gladiatorial death matches. They have chariot races where people can be run over and killed and the crowd will cheer. If you want to become Jewish, you have to give all that up. Now, obviously, if you were a gladiator and dying, that's probably not such a big loss. But if you were one of the spectators and that was your idea of fun, or if you were one of the participants in orgies or the various bacchanals, that probably would sound a bit bad. And indeed, you might think, hey, being Jewish is great. At least I have this democratic system of religion where I can be connected to God, and God is only one God, and God isn't one of these crazy gods in the pantheons. It might sound good on paper, but after a little while of being Jewish, and the conversion process in the ancient world was much faster than today, you might suddenly get a hankering for going to the theater. You know, wouldn't it be nice to go watch some blood sports? I know that I'm not supposed to because I'm Jewish now, but maybe I'm just going to take a break from my Jewishness and go. And the worry was that people who converted from these violent, licentious, immoral, pagan communities would often regret the conversion. And not only would they drift back to their original, faith, if you want to call it that, but in the process, even if they didn't leave, they might include some of their pagan morality in their life, and that would rub off on all the other Jewish people in the land. So the worry, says Rashi, is that this can be a contaminant. This can be a problem. And indeed, you look no further than King Solomon, who started off as a great and wise guy, and then he married a whole lot of women as part of political alliances that came from foreign countries and kings and princes. And by the end of his life, there was idolatry rampant throughout his household. So apparently, bringing them in, that could be a problem, says Rashi, and that may be what Rabbi Helbo was talking about. Rashi's only one voice. He tends to be the most basic of interpretations. The Tosafot, on the other hand, they have a more subtle distinction. They say, wait a minute. This has to be difficult for us, not only difficult for them. Let's see what could be going on here. When do we see an influx of converts that can be difficult? Well, during the Exodus, we know that there was the Erev Rav. There was the mixed multitude. And that mixed multitude is generally understood to have been the people who were not Jewish in Egypt, who saw us leaving and said, we're going to go with you. Whether they were fully committed to Judaism or whether just committed to getting out of Egypt seems a little shaky. And the question then became, says the Tosafot, that maybe the Jews looked at this mixed multitude and said, who are they? I don't remember them on the slave line working alongside of us. I don't remember. Which tribe do you belong to? Are you part of the children of Israel, the children of Jacob? The answer, of course, would be, well, no, not exactly. And we all know, socially, that when you are traveling together, if anybody here who's ever done traveling abroad, remember when that used to happen? When you travel abroad and you walk into an airport and there's everybody waiting and you hear somebody speaking English or you hear somebody speaking another language that you know very well, and then you hear other people in the lobby speaking different languages, which group are you going to walk up to? I'm just going to go hang out with the Canadians, right? It's just going to go hang out with the people speaking English because the people over here speaking language Y, I don't know that. And I'm not sure how much we have in common. Now it's going to be difficult and we're going to have to build bridges. It's just a lot easier to hang out with the people I already know. So indeed, when the Jewish people are said to be guarantors for each other, says the Tosafot, the Jewish people were not sure whether the mixed multitude were in on that same page, whether they were in on that same deal. We know that a member of Levi will look out for a member of Benjamin. And we know that a member of Dan will look out for a member of Naphtali. But do we know whether or not a member of the mixed multitude is going to look out for us? And if I don't know if they're going to look out for us, do I need to look out for them? There was a suspicion during that time when we left the land of Egypt, because we had not yet established that indeed that bond does extend to each and every one, and that everyone who comes under the umbrella of the Shekhinah, of God's presence, is indeed a guarantor for everyone. But at the time that Rabbi Helbo was talking, he was reflecting on this time period in our ancestry. Those are both fine explanations. They contextualize, they instruct, they give moral insight. But I think they're missing a key element, which is Rabbi Helbo didn't say converts are to Israel a difficulty. He said, like Tzara'at. Now, Tzara'at is not just a random term. It is not just a hyperbolic term. It has very strong connotations and a very strong midrashic, explanatory history. How do you get Tzara'at according to the sages? No. That's what it is. But how do you end up being the person who gets it? Because it's not medical, remember? This is not leprosy or Hansen's disease or any other ailment that we know. This is a spiritual affliction that has a physical manifestation. It does not occur anymore, so please don't ask me to diagnose you. Go to your doctor. But the rabbis are very particular about how somebody gets Tzara'at. A hidden sin, and the most common form of hidden sin was Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara, that you had spoken ill about other people. This was considered to be the most common cause of Tzara'at. That if you speak ill of others, and you're doing it, of course, behind your back and all of that, that in the days of the temple, when the strictures of purity were so strong, that it would eventually reveal itself that you were this duplicitous gossiper, and it would reveal itself through the affliction of Tzara'at. Now we can take and unpack Rabbi Helbo's interpretation and say converts are hard for Israel like Tzara'at, because unfortunately Israel is prone to Lashon Hara against converts. Israel is prone to speaking bad of those who have joined the nation of Israel. It's a tendency. As we can see, there is some precedent, like with Solomon's wives, of sometimes there are problems that come from those who convert. But unfortunately, it is not limited only to those that are deserving to be criticized, like the historical Solomon. Indeed, when the Talmud is talking about the need to guard our speech against others, one of the absolute classic examples of ona'at devarim, of oppressing a person of words, is by giving a backhanded compliment of constantly reminding somebody who converted, hey, didn't you used to be one of those pagan bloodthirsty orgy goers? It's great that you're with us now. Reminding someone again and again and again of such a background is no compliment. And yet the Talmud holds that out as being a problem that was so common that they had to put it at the top of the list of things you don't say. You don't put things at the top of the list that aren't being said often. So when Rabbi Helbo was saying that this is difficult for Israel, I believe that what he was trying to say was Israel has difficulty accepting converts without treating them badly sometimes. And unfortunately, a couple thousand years later, we're still doing it. We're still doing it. Not so much. I think we've gotten pretty good in our own congregation. We can always be better. But if you are a watcher of the news from the state of Israel, you know that there's an election coming up. And if you've been watching the election news, you know that the Supreme Court of Israel just stirred up a new hornet's nest by actually doing what they've been threatening to do for decades, which is say, if somebody is converted in Israel by a reform or conservative congregation, their conversion is valid. And once that was said, all hell broke loose. But not just people being angry and disagreeing. Pictures of dogs wearing kippot are now on the election posters to say, if you allow the Supreme Court to do this, if you don't vote for our party, which is defending real Judaism, then you are letting dogs into our people. That you are letting the corrupt into our people. That you are letting the bloodthirsty, immoral orgy goers who are going to debauch our country. Because as we all know, that's what Reform and conservative Judaism is all about. I think we'd probably have more attendance, COVID or no, if that was what we were doing. This is Lashon Hara, of highest order. It's worse than Lashon Hara. It goes into the realm of being sheker, of being a flat-out lie. Because as we know, those who are converted in non-Orthodox systems are not only Jews, but they are committed Jews to the same degree as Jews that were born into those systems or indeed into Orthodoxy. Yes, there are different practices. Yes, there are different interpretations of Jewish law. But you still see them going to shul. You still see them observing the mitzvot according to the ways of their movements. You still see them committed to Jewish life. But that's not, unfortunately, what our brothers and sisters in the ultra-Orthodox world see. There have been some in the more moderate Orthodox who have indeed said, this is the right decision by the Supreme Court, and they are defending the conservative and Reform communities of Israel. But 99% of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox have taken the opposite political view, that this will be the downfall of Israel. This will be the destruction of the Jewish state. And that therefore in the coming election, they need to make sure that nobody votes for any parties that approve of such a thing, and that indeed new legislation is implemented to overturn the Supreme Court ruling, which, as I said, had been on pause for decades, hoping the government would make a law that would clarify it without the Supreme Court having to do it. Now they want to make a law to clarify it in the opposite direction. That this has become what the election is about for many, many people in the land of Israel. Will Israel have the status of allowing those who convert under the non-Orthodox movements to be considered Jews? That's it. That's all that's being asked. Or will they not? Now, there are many who say, well, wait a minute. I understand when we're out here in Artsot Habrit, the land of the United States, or if you live in Europe, that, you guys do what you guys are going to do. Because whatever, you're out there in the diaspora. You're in Galut. But in Israel, we need to have a standard, right? In Israel, there needs to be an authority which will establish what is and what isn't Jewish. Because after all, if this is going to be the Jewish homeland, we can't just throw the doors open for anyone, right? I mean, after all, we know that it was already established that those who were born Jewish but who forsook that and adopted a completely different religion are not eligible for the right of return until they return to Judaism. That has been clarified, and I think most parties agree to that. So after all, if we have one limit, shouldn't we have more? And wouldn't it be only logical that the limit that should be established would be the limit of the highest caliber, the highest stricture, to ensure that everybody will accept anybody that is there? It's just common sense, right? We need to allow the levers of authority and coercion to be held in the hands of those who can protect the Jewish identity of the state. It's so seductive, isn't it? And it's so wrong. And it was known to be wrong 150, 70, I have to keep adjusting my dates, years ago. Rabbi Samuel Raphael Hirsch, one of my favorite writers, who would be considered an early proponent of Orthodoxy, wrote in the 1800s, as he saw the twin birth of the Reform movement and the Orthodox movement born in struggle, like Jacob and Esau, he said, we do not want to use authority to settle this struggle. We do not want to establish institutions that will impose a resolution. Let the scales swing free. That's scales of justice, to go back to our idioms. Allow people to choose where they want to go. Allow people to express themselves. Allow the ideologies of all of these movements to run their course. Let people express what they are feeling, the frustrations, the hopes, the desires, the fears, the passions, and history will sort this out. But if, he argued, if you institute something, if you give an authority to clamp down and enshrine one particular vision, then the birth pangs of the labor of the modern world will continue indefinitely. We will be trapped forever in that struggle. And indeed, in 1948, when Israel was established, they established an authority to clamp down on precisely this issue. And Israel has been wrestling with this topic since 1948, of what will its identity be. But it has been trying to wrestle with that topic from a top-down view. In the United States, we've known that you don't need a top-down view. You don't need somebody with the reins of power to coerce or incentivize a particular vision of Judaism. You know what you do? You let Jews be Jews. And they will sort themselves out. And they will build JCCs and federations, not because the government gave them funding, not because someone forced them to do it, not because someone has mandated a Jewish curriculum, but because they want Judaism for their community. And they will build synagogues that match the ideology of different people. And they will attend, and they will send their children, and their children will learn, and their children will associate. And yes, some of them may eventually implode. And that will be tragic. But do you honestly think you can preserve the vital and life-giving path of Judaism by imprisoning the Jewish people into one particular version of Judaism that you have decided is the version that will survive for all time? Do you believe that will actually give the passion necessary to allow Judaism to compete in the free market world of ideas? Because that's where we are now. There is no going back to the Middle Ages where we can safely be locked away at night by our Goyish neighbors into our ghetto and know that there is no alternative but to stay with those that are there. We can leave anytime we want, and indeed many people have. But I look around here, and I know those that are watching through the stream, you have chosen to be here. You have decided that this is what you wish to do. And you have done so with no hope of financial gain. Indeed, quite the contrary very often. You have done so without me having to threaten you, without your community having to bully you, without any elements of coercion, without any authority to push you to be here. And that makes us strong. That gives us a hope for the future. Because if I didn't know that each of you could get up and walk out that door at any time, what faith would I have for the future of our people? What would I get from hope by just watching you sit? If I knew you were here because the government had mandated it, that this was the only place you could be, and that if you weren't here, you would be in trouble, pay a fine, or you'd already paid your taxes, so you might as well, or this was the only place where your kids could get an education, or this is where you had to build connections to help yourself in the business world, I have to say, I would doubt your connection to Judaism. I would doubt your faith in God. But when I see you come on Friday and Saturday and logging in for Minyan, attending classes, participating in our social activities, all the things that we do, I know that you are choosing Judaism again and again and again, freely and passionately with your heart. And that is exactly what happens to each person who wasn't born Jewish, but converts as well. There is no benefit for them to do so. There is no amazing reserve of Jewish wealth, much as our opponents might say there is, that we are going to hand out now that someone has crossed the threshold to become Jewish. It's not like now that you've converted, you can get a mortgage. Or now that you've converted, you're going to have access to the secret clubs where the Jews meet to plan the world domination. Because that's all a joke and a farce told by our enemies. When people become Jewish, we know that they are giving up much. When you choose to stay Jewish, you are giving up much. But you are receiving it beautifully in return by what you gain from your participation. And that is exactly what Rabbi Samuel Raphael Hirsch was trying to tell us more than 170 years ago. let the scales swing free, and you will see those who step onto the side of scale that says, I want Judaism. I want it, not because you force me, not because you have made it so that it's impossible for me to not be Jewish, not because you have incentivized it in some way, but because I want it. That is where the future of Judaism will lie. And that is true in this country, and it is true in Eretz Israel as well. So a friend in need is a friend indeed. Please, after Shabbat, look for the Masorti movement online. Support them as they continue to support the efforts of Jews of all types who are trying to have a better life in the land of Israel. And as they are enriched, so are we. It's your choice. I'm not going to force you. Shabbat Shalom.